All right, for the next subject we're going to study, we're going to be covering perspective. There's a lot to cover in perspective, so it's might be kind of confusing at first, but hopefully this presentation will help you a little bit. When we think about perspective in something that is 2D, an image that is two-dimensional, we think of space. We think of how perspective creates a sense of depth. And even in this image right here, we can see how there is depth being created with all of these lines that are going back into space with the shapes that are bigger on the outside and the shapes that gets smaller on the inside in the spiral staircase. And even we can think about how light is used in this as well. So it's like it feels really dark up close and then gets lighter as we go through the image. One thing that you have been doing with perspective or creating a sense of space so far is you've been creating these still lives, where I always ask you all to overlap your objects in order to create this depth. So on the left, there's an example of these different shapes that are all floating next to each other. You can see it creates no sense of depth. But on the right, once you start to overlap these shapes, you get a sense of depth. That's something you've been doing already. In this example here, we can see that linear perspective is not totally necessary to create a sense of depth either. We can see that we can make a sense of depth by adding shades of gray to these rectangular examples. We haven't really gotten into shading or light logic or values. That's the term that I use to talk about those shades of gray. I'll be using the word values, but that is something that you can keep in mind when creating depth in your images as well. So lighter things tend to come forward, darker things tend to go backwards. So we're going to know the different types of perspective by the time that we're done with this slideshow. We're going to cover first, this is an example of foreshortened perspective, a type of perspective where an artist uses scale and really pushes scale in order to create a sense of depth. So we definitely feel as an audience that we're looking at these hands really up close, very in our face in the foreground, which are painted super large, almost takes up the entire canvas here. And then in the background, you have the face, the head of the person whose hands they're connected to, which is painted really, really small in comparison. So this is called foreshortening. We also have atmospheric perspective, which is a way of creating depth. In this example here, we have these rocks that are drawn. These rocks that are in the foreground are rendered very clearly. There's high contrast. It's detailed. And then as you can see, this like stack of rocks as it goes back in space, there's less contrast. It becomes more hazy and there's a lot less detail. This is an example of atmospheric perspective. So let's go through a brief history of perspective because it's really funny and really awkward to see how us as humans have interpreted perspective over time. So here we have what you all can recognize, like an Egyptian manuscript, where this is in this ancient civilization, people wanted to talk about their deities, their religion, their gods, and they did a really good job of doing this, but they had no idea of how to really create a sense of depth that well. So everything in Egyptian art is very flat. Even the faces, they're always done in a profile view, are always really flat. But you can see that the artists who were making these were actually trying to touch on depth a little bit just by that overlapping of the characters that they have, especially the characters on the left there. Now we're still in this example, we're still in an ancient civilization. We're in ancient Greece, and we have an artist who's trying to paint a theater, and they're doing a good job, but it's not quite really on point as far as 1-point linear perspective, which linear perspective is what we're going to really dive into for perspective, the perspective subject. So if we are trying to figure out where the vanishing point is for this theater, we can cover all of the different angles of the different parts of the architecture of this theater and see how they are all intersecting in different places. So you have the blue diagonal lines, those are all intersecting on one point on that vertical pink line. And then you have these green diagonal lines that are lined up with different walls and such on the left and right of the theater, which are intersecting in a different place than the blue lines are intersecting. So that being said, that's a little bit off for sure, but the artist was trying, and I think doing a really good job as far as effort goes. Here's a great example of a very like magical Renaissance-y, medieval, actually, excuse me, this is a very medieval painting. And it's really funny. I just love this painting so much. Like, let's start with the girl on the left with the wooden spoon and the dirty water. What is she doing? I have no idea. But all I know is that the box that she's scooping out that water from with her little wooden ladle, the perspective is really wonky. Like, it doesn't feel like that box is made well, at least. And then our eyes go, we can go up to that wall on the left there, that diagonal wall, which is bizarre. It feels like maybe it's coming forward, maybe it's going down a hill, maybe it's even going backward, especially when I look at the way that it connects to the horizontal wall up there. And then my eye comes down onto that table, which makes me feel like I might be flying over this garden scene. But that's really confusing considering the perspective of the wall behind everyone, especially also because like the way that we're looking straight forward at all of the figures of the people in the garden too. So it's weird, but once again, they're trying. In this Byzantine example that we have here, Byzantine style artwork, I don't know if you recognize it, a lot of gold leaf, really fun. The artist is in Byzantine style artwork. Every artist was trying to kind of put different saints and angels on these pedestals. But on the example on the right, you can see if we put lines over the different architectural elements of these pedestals and these thrones, we can see that the lines don't intersect anywhere. So we can see once again, the artists are trying to create a sense of dimension, but are just really doing a lot better job just modeling the faces and the figures itself. This artist, Giotto di Bondone, was an Italian artist who in the 1337 was trying to use algebra to hone in on understanding linear perspective, which no one understood at this point. But he knew that he wanted to try, and he did try very hard, but things still were not lining up. So in order to understand perspective accurately or space accurately as possible, people started inventing these tools to try to figure out how to translate what they were looking at as realistically as possible onto their pieces of paper or canvas. So this artist, Albrecht Dürer, in this example of this etching, he used a grid, it was just like a transparent grid that he put in front of a model. And in the grid, there would be like 1 to 1 inch size squares for each part of the grid, which he would translate to the same ratio onto his canvas or piece of paper. He would also use what was called a sight vane, an instrument developed by this artist Dürer to maintain a fixed viewpoint. So there was really interesting technologies that came around for when people were like really trying to hone in on linear perspective and get it right. This is an illustration of a camera obscura. You might have heard of this before, but many old master painters probably use this to capture photo-like proportions and a sense of realism. A good film to look up is Tim's Vermeer. Vermeer was an artist. He painted a girl with a pearl earring. It's kind of a famous painting. They made a movie out of it with Scarlett Johansson. But anyways, this this camera obscura was really cool. They would make a box without any light in it, and then they would carve out a little hole, and then it would reflect an image of whatever was on the other side of that hole into the box on the other side of the wall, but upside down. And then the artist would just essentially just trace over that and then, you know, hang it right side up when the artist was done. I'm gonna put in a video on this artist because he was the one who is accredited for actually understanding linear perspective. Filippo Brunelleschi, he ended up doing this experiment when he used geometry and a vanishing point in order to understand 1 point linear perspective when he drew the Duomo church. And then he, in the video, you'll see exactly like how he proved his experiment to work. But he was finally the guy who understood it and then just changed the direction of art afterwards. Because now that people have the understanding of linear perspective, that was always applied to creating a sense of depth from there on out. All right, so linear perspective, that's kind of what we're going to be diving into this week. There are 5 types of linear perspective: 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I'm going to cover 1, 2, and 3 and 5 a little bit, just skip over 4, but 1, 2, and 3 are ones that we can kind of probably digest a little bit easier today. I'm going to read off before we start talking these different definitions because I think it's really important for you to know what I'm talking about as we cover this subject. So the horizon is the line where the sky meets the land or water. The height of the horizon influences the placement of the vanishing points and the elevation of the scene. So, you know, if I am doing an art piece where I'm painting a mountain, but I'm on the bottom of a mountain, that horizon line is going to fall differently as opposed to if I'm on top of a mountain looking down onto a mountain. So the horizon line is going to change depending on where I am. The vanishing point is a place where all the parallel lines appear to meet in the distance. In disregard that, the parallel lines, like for example, parallel lines of a road recede or travel backwards and visually merge to create a single vanishing point on the horizon. There is no limit to the number of vanishing points that a scene can have. Keep that in mind. A ground plane. The ground plane is the horizontal surface below the horizon and may be land or water. And the orthogonal lines are the lines directed to a vanishing point. Orthogonal means right angle. It refers to right angles that are formed by lines such as the corner of a cube shown in perspective. And the vantage point, not to be confused with the vanishing point. The vantage point is the place from which a scene is viewed. The placement of the horizon and the vanishing points affect the vanishing point. Just like I was saying in that example, I'm below a mountain or I'm above a mountain. It's really, really important to know where you are when you are drawing linear perspective. That's your vantage point. Here's an example of 1 point perspective, just a quick little sketch here. In 1 point perspective, in linear perspective, we have one vanishing point. It always falls on the horizon line. And you can see this is a really great tool if I ever wanted to draw the interior of a room, or really the interior of any type of cube-shaped architectural place or thing. Here is a Vermeer painting, the guy who painted that girl with the pearl earring. And this is a good example of 1 point perspective. He's painting these 2 characters in a room. Obviously, Vermeer, when he painted this, he couldn't see the horizon line, right? But because he knew where his vantage point was, he was able to put down the horizon line and then line up all the other architectural elements in the room to that one vanishing point. So keep in mind, when you go out and you ever try drawing linear perspective from life, The horizon line is always pretty much lands in the middle of your eyesight. 2-point perspective, this is a great example of, once again, you have the horizon line. It's falling kind of in the middle of our scene here, and you have a vanishing point on the left and the right. And note how those vanishing points are outside of the rectangle, which insinuates, the edge of our drawing paper. 2-point perspective is great for drawing corners. Here we go, having another example by Vermeer of 2-point perspective here, with the vanishing points going off of the image, but you can see it was really great for him to draw this kind of corner scene, complicated corner scene, where all the elements of the architecture line up, like the tiles on the floors and the beams in the roof. 3-point perspective is really fun, and it can be used to create a sense of drama in space. Oftentimes, it is used by illustrators, comic book illustrators, in order to show these kinds of cityscapes where their characters are floating in the sky, showing just that sense of drama, how far away these superheroes are from the bottom of the earth, really capturing that height. This is the MC Escher artist that I showed you in the negative space slideshow, and you can see that he was really good at understanding perspective himself and was able to create this image of a fisheye lens where he is looking at himself. This is a self-portrait of MC Escher. And the 5-point perspective that is done here is really great for creating that fisheye effect. And then lastly, we're going to finish with the artist David Hockney, a living artist. This piece is from 1988. His color palette's really fun, really exuberant, and he's really has a super playful sense of space, and he understands perspective, but he breaks the rules of perspective to create this kind of comical, humorous scene. And that's something that you can do too once you understand it. So I hope that this helps, and I hope you have fun actually doing the linear drawing perspective assignment.